Okay, so this is the first episode in a 3-episode series where we're going to discuss training the muscles of the core. I'm going to present to you my views on how we should train the core and my approach to core training. Certainly this isn't something that I've developed or pioneered. These are ideas that are used widely across the sort of continuum of strength and conditioning, used by personal trainers, used by people in athletic development. These are widely used concepts, but the reason I felt it necessary to do this video was, as someone working in a gym, I see a lot of people taking kind of a suboptimal approach to core training, prioritizing sort of spinal flexion and hip flexion rather than thinking about actually what are the purposes of the core and how can we train, to make that training more kind of functional, although I don't like that term. Trying to think about, why we use our core, what it's for, and then training it with that purpose in mind. So we're going to look at we're going to have 3 videos in this series. Today we're going to talk about the function and the anatomy of the core, and we're just going to start introducing some ways that I train the core. And the second and third video are going to look at the anti-movement approaches and movement approaches to training the core. Okay, so the first thing that we look at is the function of the core. When we start to think about how to train the core, we want to think about what's its primary purpose. What does it do on a general basis, or in a sporting environment? What function would our core play? And when we start to understand a bit more about that, we can start to think about strategies of how to train it efficiently. So one of the primary purposes of the core, or the functions of the core, would be to stabilise the spine and the torso during movement. So a really simple example would be just walking. So with the force exerted by our legs and arms moving, our core has to stabilise the spine to keep us in an optimal position. Secondly, really simple one, along with the ribs, it would help to protect the organ. It would help to protect the organs. So if we receive some sort of a blow in, say, a sporting environment, the muscles of the torso are going to help to protect. Second one, really important in sports, but just in general life as well. It aids in effective power transference through the kinetic chain. So when we're running, for example, we're generating force, and force is starting with that connection to the ground from the foot. If we want to get all of that power up into our body, it needs to come through the muscles of our torso, because we need to move the other kind of distal ends of our body as well. And let's put that in a weightlifting context. If we're talking about pressing a weight overhead, somehow we need to transfer all the force that we can generate from the floor into that movement overhead, and all that force needs to transfer through the torso. So if we don't want to lose any of that force, and we want to get the maximum amount of force going into the weight, we need to learn how to brace and engage the muscles of our torso. And lastly, this is the final thing that I consider when thinking about training the core after we've achieved stability, would be moving the actual torso. So actually, flexion, lateral flexion, things like that. So the next thing that we want to consider, now that we've established the function of the core, is what does the actual core mean? The core is just an overriding term for a collection of muscles that, as we've found out, help to stabilise the torso primarily. So the muscles of the torso, from the posterior to the anterior side, as well as the muscles of the hip complex, are the muscles that we're talking about when we talk about the core. I've just listed a few of the main ones here. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, and I've put in a couple of other ones that we want to consider as well, that you might not think are actually muscles that are involved in the core. So we've got the pelvic floor, transversus abdominis, multifidus, internal external obliques, rectus abdominis, which is the six-pack, erector spinae, the muscles that run along the spine, and then the other muscles that I want you to think about when we train the core are ones that you might not think. So the latissimus dorsi, your lats, the glutes, every part of the glute complex, trapezius, hip flexors, and the quadratus lumbarum. Again, not an exhaustive list, I'm sure there are many others, but these are the ones that we're kind of primarily focusing on at the moment. So we've covered function and we've covered anatomy, and now we want to start thinking about some strategies to training the core. And when I think about approaching core training, we want to think about 3 things: anti-movement, movement, and the third one is bracing, and we'll come to that in its own section when we look at anti-movement in the second video. Let's just have a little look at these two sections, so anti-movement and movement. In the anti-movement section, we want to think about resisting external forces and the way that the torso may react when an external force is introduced. So we've broken that down into 4 sections. Anti-extension, and an example of that would be a plank, or anti-hyperextension. Anti-forward flexion, and an example of that would be a kettlebell rack carry, so holding kettlebells in the rack position. Anti-lateral flexion, an example would be the suitcase deadlift. And anti-rotation, and again, an example would be the Pallof press. So if you've got some idea of some of these exercises, it's just starting to give you a bit of an understanding as to what we're talking about when we're talking about anti-movement in terms of core training. When we talk about movement, again, we're using the same planes of movement. We're using flexion, extension, lateral flexion and rotation, and to train those we're thinking about moving in that way. So when we think about forward flexion, we're looking at a sit-up, extension, a prone back extension, lateral flexion, dumbbell side bend, and rotation, a cable wood chop. And again, if you've got some idea about these exercises, it will start getting you thinking about what we're talking about when we're talking about movement and training the core. Okay, so let's just sum up what we've spoken about today. As I said, in the next 2 videos we'll go into greater details in terms of strategy for training the core, but I found this quote from a study called The Role of Core Stability in Athletic Function. And I'm not going to try and pronounce some of the names of the guys that wrote that, but it's a really interesting study actually. So it's if you Google the role of core stability in athletic function, I'm sure you can find it. Go and have a read, it's really interesting. I think it's a nice way of just describing exactly the function of the core. It would be a good way to round off the video. Core stability is defined as the ability to control the position and motion of the trunk over the pelvis to allow optimum production, transfer and control of force and motion to the terminal segment in integrated athletic activities. So I think that just sums up exactly what we were talking about in this video, starting to think about the actual functions of the musculature of the torso and thinking about training it to improve its function. That's the end of today's video. Stay tuned for video 2, which is going to be focusing on anti-movement, and we'll discuss bracing in that video as well. And then video 3, where we'll look at movement strategies in terms of training the core. If you like the content and you want to see more, go to www.pikefitness.co.uk, sign up to our mailing list, and you'll receive updates as to all the content that we're releasing.